There is a moment that arrives in the life of almost every disciplined saver that nobody adequately prepares them for. It is not the moment of struggle, not the difficult early months of building the habit, not the resistance phase that tests commitment around month 7, not even the daily small sacrifices that accumulate into meaningful savings over time. It is the moment of arrival, the moment when the target has actually been reached, when the $1,000 or whatever specific number represented the goal sits there, real and accumulated, for the first time in a person's financial life. And in that exact moment, a question arrives that determines everything that follows. A question far more consequential than anything required to reach this point. What happens now? This question matters more than almost any other financial decision a person will make, because the answer determines whether this first, meaningful capital becomes the foundation of genuine, lasting wealth, or whether it becomes simply a slightly larger version of the same spend and restart cycle that the entire saving discipline was meant to escape in the first place. Dangote faced this exact question with his own first meaningful capital, decades before the empire that would eventually bear his name existed in any recognizable form. The decision he made at that specific moment, not the discipline that accumulated the capital, not the hard work that followed afterward, but the specific decision about what to do with that first real sum of money, set the trajectory for everything that came after. Today I'm going to walk through exactly how that kind of decision should be made, using a framework that applies as directly to your first $1,000 as it applied to Dangote's first meaningful trading capital. Why this decision is harder than it appears. Before the framework itself, I want to explain why this specific moment is genuinely difficult, because underestimating the difficulty is precisely what causes so many people to make poor decisions at exactly this point. The difficulty comes from a specific psychological phenomenon that researchers studying financial behavior have documented extensively. After a sustained period of disciplined restriction, the months of careful allocation, the resisted temptations, the boundaries held against family requests, there is a powerful psychological pull toward release. The mind, having maintained discipline for an extended period, seeks some form of resolution, some signal that the period of restriction has concluded and a reward has been earned. This pull is not a character flaw. It is a well-documented feature of how sustained self-control functions psychologically. The problem is that this pull toward release frequently gets directed at exactly the wrong target, the accumulated capital itself, rather than some separate, modest acknowledgement of the achievement. There is a second source of difficulty specific to this moment. Once capital accumulates to a meaningful level, it becomes visible to family members, to community members, to anyone aware of a person's general financial situation. This visibility frequently triggers exactly the kind of requests and expectations discussed extensively in earlier content on this channel, arriving at precisely the moment when the capital is most vulnerable to being redirected, before any deliberate decision about its use has been made. A third source of difficulty is simply the absence of a clear framework for evaluating options. Most people, having never had meaningful capital to allocate before, do not have a developed mental structure for comparing one potential use of that capital against another. Without such a structure, decisions tend to be made based on whichever option feels most immediately appealing or most recently suggested by someone else, rather than through any systematic evaluation. This is precisely the gap that Dangote's example and the framework I'm about to walk through is designed to fill. The 4-question framework. Here is the specific framework for evaluating what to do with meaningful first capital, structured as 4 sequential questions that should be asked in order, with each question narrowing the field of reasonable options before the next question is considered. The first question: does this preserve or destroy the capital? This is the most fundamental question, and it should be asked before any other consideration enters the decision. Some potential uses of capital, by their nature, consume it entirely with no realistic expectation of return. A celebration, a significant purchase for personal enjoyment, a generous gift to someone else. These uses are not inherently wrong, but they share a common characteristic. Once executed, the capital is gone. It does not exist in any form afterward, available for further decisions or future use. Other potential uses preserve the capital in some form, even while changing its specific shape, placing it in a savings instrument, however modest the returns, preserves the underlying capital while it potentially grows. Investing it in inventory for a trading activity converts cash into goods, but the underlying value remains intact and recoverable, assuming the trading activity is reasonably sound. Using it as the foundation for a small income-generating activity, as discussed in the second income framework covered previously, transforms the capital's form without destroying its substance. The first question, asked honestly about any specific option under consideration, immediately separates options that consume the capital permanently from options that preserve it in some recoverable form. This single distinction eliminates a substantial portion of the options that initially seem appealing in the moment of having reached this milestone. This does not mean that every dollar of accumulated capital must be permanently preserved with no allowance whatsoever for any form of celebration or reward. The milestone recognition discussed in earlier content on this channel specifically addresses the legitimate psychological need for acknowledgement, but that acknowledgement should come from a separate, modest, predetermined allowance, not from redirecting the core, accumulated capital itself toward consumption. The second question, does this generate return or merely sit still? Having eliminated options that destroy the capital entirely, the second question addresses the remaining options that preserve the capital in some form, asking whether that preserved capital is actively generating additional value or simply existing in a static state. Capital sitting in a basic savings account, particularly in economic environments with meaningful inflation, is technically preserved in nominal terms while actually losing real value over time, as the purchasing power of that specific amount erodes against rising prices. This represents preservation in name only, while functioning in practical terms as a slow form of value destruction. Capital deployed into an income-generating activity, whether trading, a small service business, rental of an asset, or a return-generating investment instrument, has the potential to grow in real terms, assuming the specific activity is reasonably sound and well executed. This second question requires honest evaluation of the specific options available, rather than defaulting automatically to whichever option requires the least immediate effort or carries the least immediate uncertainty. Dangote's decision to direct his early trading capital into the purchase of goods for resale, rather than simply holding the capital in a static state, reflects exactly this principle, recognizing that capital sitting idle, even when nominally preserved, represents a missed opportunity relative to capital actively deployed toward generating additional return. The third question, does this match your actual capability or your aspirational capability? This question addresses a specific failure pattern that affects a substantial portion of people who reach meaningful first capital for the first time. There is a strong temptation, having proven the capacity for disciplined accumulation, to deploy that capital toward an ambitious venture that significantly exceeds current practical experience, knowledge, or capability. This temptation often arrives dressed in language about ambition, about thinking big, about not settling for small opportunities when larger ones theoretically exist. The specific problem with this temptation is that meaningful capital deployed into a venture that exceeds actual current capability frequently produces losses, precisely because of that capability gap, regardless of how promising the underlying opportunity may appear in theory. The more reliable approach, and the approach Dangote's own trajectory demonstrates clearly, involves deploying first meaningful capital into an activity closely aligned with existing knowledge, existing relationships, and existing practical experience, even if that activity appears more modest in scale or ambition than alternatives that might be theoretically available. Dangote's first meaningful trading activity involved goods and markets he already understood from direct observation and existing relationships, rather than an unfamiliar venture into a sector he had no practical experience with, regardless of how that unfamiliar sector might have appeared more exciting or potentially lucrative in theory. This specific alignment between capital deployment and existing capability is precisely why that first deployment succeeded reliably enough to generate the returns that eventually funded much larger and more ambitious ventures, once both capital and capability had grown substantially through that initial, more modest activity. The third question, applied honestly to any specific option under consideration, asks whether this option matches what you can actually execute reliably right now, given your current knowledge and experience, rather than what you aspire to be capable of executing at some future point. The fourth question, what happens if this specific deployment fails? This final question addresses risk management directly, and it should be applied to whichever option survives. The first 3 questions before any final decision is made. Every deployment of capital carries some risk of partial or complete loss, regardless of how carefully the first 3 questions have been applied. The 4th question asks specifically what the consequence would be if this particular deployment failed entirely, not as a reason to avoid any deployment that carries risk, since virtually every productive use of capital carries some risk, but as a way of ensuring the magnitude of potential loss remains, proportionate to what can genuinely be absorbed without catastrophic consequence. For a first meaningful capital accumulation, this generally means avoiding deployment of the entire amount into a single concentrated option, regardless of how promising that specific option appears after the first 3 questions have been applied. A more prudent approach typically involves deploying a portion of the capital, perhaps the majority, but rarely the entirety, into the option that has passed the first 3 questions most convincingly, while preserving some portion as a buffer against the possibility that the deployment does not perform as expected. This 4th question is precisely why Dangote's early trading activities, even as they scaled over years, maintained a pattern of incremental deployment and reinvestment, rather than concentrating the entirety of available capital into any single transaction or venture, regardless of how favorable that specific opportunity appeared. This pattern of measured incremental deployment, rather than complete concentration, is precisely what allowed early setbacks, and there were setbacks, as there are for virtually everyone, who deploys capital into any productive activity over an extended period, to be absorbed without eliminating the entire foundation that had been built through the preceding period of disciplined accumulation. If you are still watching, subscribe right now, because what comes next addresses the specific categories of deployment available to someone at this exact stage, moving from the abstract framework into concrete, practical options relevant to African markets specifically. The specific deployment categories available right now. Having walked through the framework for evaluating any specific option, let me address the actual categories of deployment that are realistically available to someone with their first $1,000 or similar amount of accumulated capital, evaluated against the 4-question framework just discussed. The first category is deployment into an existing, income-generating activity you have already begun. If you have already started a small trading activity, a service-based income stream, or any other form of second income discussed previously, your first meaningful accumulated capital often finds its most reliable deployment by expanding that existing, already proven activity rather than launching an entirely new venture from scratch. This category scores favorably against the 3rd question specifically, since it deploys capital into an activity where capability has already been demonstrated through direct experience rather than an unfamiliar venture, requiring an entirely new set of skills and knowledge to be developed simultaneously with the capital deployment itself. The second category is deployment into a formal investment instrument appropriate to your specific market. Across many African markets, government treasury bills, fixed deposit accounts offering meaningfully better returns than basic savings accounts, and various forms of regulated investment funds provide a way to deploy capital toward generating return without requiring the development of an entirely new operational skill set. This category scores favorably against the 2nd question, generating return rather than simply preserving nominal value, while also scoring favorably against the 4th question, since formal, regulated investment instruments typically carry more predictable and limited risk profiles compared to direct entrepreneurial deployment into an unfamiliar venture. The specific instruments available vary considerably by country and by the size of capital involved, and this is an area where seeking guidance from a qualified financial professional familiar with your specific market and circumstances is genuinely valuable, given the variation in available options and their specific terms across different African financial markets. The 3rd category is deployment into education or skill development directly, tied to increasing future earning capacity. This category is frequently underweighted relative to its actual value, because the return on this type of deployment is less immediately visible than the return on capital deployed into a trading activity or formal investment instrument, a specific course, certification, or skill development opportunity that meaningfully increases earning capacity in your existing field or opens a viable new income avenue can produce a return on that initial capital deployment that substantially exceeds what the same amount would generate through more conventional financial deployment. This category requires honest evaluation against the third question specifically. The skill or education being pursued should align with a realistic path toward applying that increased capability, rather than representing aspirational credentialing, with no clear connection to an actual subsequent income opportunity. The fourth category, mentioned specifically to address it directly rather than leave it unaddressed, is deployment into a small-scale asset that generates ongoing returns, what was discussed previously as rental income in the second income framework. A modest piece of equipment that can be rented out, a small addition to inventory that generates trading margin, or a similarly modest productive asset, appropriate to your specific capital level and market. Knowledge can provide a foundation for ongoing income generation, building directly on the framework discussed in earlier. Content regarding second income streams. What Dangote's specific choice teaches us. I want to return specifically to how Dangote's own early decision illustrates this framework in action, because the specific logic of that decision remains directly applicable today, regardless of the vastly different scale his eventual enterprise reached. His decision to direct early capital into trading activity rather than alternative uses available at the time satisfied each of the four questions in sequence. The capital was preserved and deployed rather than consumed, satisfying the first question. The trading activity generated active return through buying and reselling goods at a margin, rather than simply holding the capital statically, satisfying the second question. The specific goods and markets involved were ones where direct knowledge and existing relationships already existed, rather than requiring entry into an entirely unfamiliar sector, satisfying the third question. And the specific scale of initial deployment, while meaningful, did not represent a concentration of capital so extreme that a single unfavorable outcome would have eliminated the entire foundation. Satisfying the fourth question. This is precisely why that initial deployment, modest as it was in absolute terms compared to what would eventually follow, succeeded reliably enough to generate the returns that funded subsequent, larger decisions over the following years and decades. The framework that guided that first decision is the same framework, applied at whatever scale is relevant to your own specific first meaningful capital, that determines whether your own accumulated 1,000 becomes the foundation of an expanding financial trajectory, or simply a single moment of accumulation that resets back towards zero once spent. The compounding effect of getting this decision right. I want to close with a specific illustration of why this particular decision matters disproportionately compared to almost any other financial decision you will make, because the effect of getting this decision right or wrong compounds substantially over subsequent years. Consider two versions of the same person, both having reached the same $1,000 milestone through the same 11-month process described in the previous roadmap. In the first version, that 1,000 gets directed toward a specific purchase or celebration that, while providing genuine immediate satisfaction, leaves no remaining capital once the transaction is complete. This person then begins the entire accumulation process again from zero, requiring another extended period of disciplined saving before any meaningful capital exists again. In the second version, that same $1,000 gets deployed according to the framework just described, perhaps, into an existing trading activity, generating a modest but real return over the subsequent year. Even a relatively modest return of 20% annually, achievable through various forms of disciplined deployment discussed in this video, transforms that $1,000 into $200 by the end of the following year, without any additional saving required beyond the deployment decision itself. If this same person continues both the regular savings, discipline established previously, and reinvests the returns generated by the deployed capital, the trajectory over subsequent years diverges substantially from the first version, who repeatedly returns to zero after each accumulation cycle. This divergence, compounded across years and eventually decades, represents precisely the mechanism by which Dangote's own trajectory unfolded, not through a single, dramatic decision or extraordinary stroke of luck, but through the consistent application of exactly this principle, repeated across an extended career, at a scale that grew progressively larger as each successive deployment generated returns that became the capital for the subsequent deployment. The specific amount involved in your own first deployment decision, whether 1,000 or some other, amount relevant to your own circumstances, matters far less than the principle being established through that decision. The habit of evaluating capital deployment through a structured framework, preserving and growing capital rather than simply consuming it upon accumulation, is precisely the habit that determines whether subsequent decades produce genuine accumulated wealth or a repeated cycle of accumulation and return to zero that never produces lasting financial progress. Despite genuine effort and discipline at each individual stage, what you do when you reach your milestone, I want to leave you with something specific and immediately actionable, applicable whether you have already reached your own first meaningful savings milestone or are still in the process of building toward it using the roadmap discussed previously. Before that moment arrives, decide in advance, using the 4-question framework discussed in this video, what category of deployment you intend to pursue once the milestone is reached. Deciding this in advance, before the psychological pull toward release and reward arrives at the actual moment of achievement, significantly increases the likelihood that the decision made will be the deliberate, evaluated decision rather than an impulsive one driven by the emotional experience of having just reached a meaningful goal. Identify specifically which of the 4 deployment categories discussed expanding an existing income activity, a formal investment instrument, education or skill development, or a small income-generating asset, most closely matches your own specific circumstances, existing knowledge, and practical capability. Applying the 3rd question from the framework honestly to your own situation, and separately decide on a modest, predetermined acknowledgement of the achievement itself, distinct from the core capital, that satisfies the legitimate psychological need for recognition, discussed earlier in this video, without requiring that recognition to come from redirecting the capital that took such sustained discipline to accumulate in the first place. This is the decision that determined everything that followed in Dangote's own trajectory, decades before the empire, that would eventually bear his name, existed in any recognizable form. The same decision, applied with the same framework at whatever scale is relevant to your own circumstances, determines whether your own first meaningful capital becomes the foundation of a similarly expanding trajectory, or simply a meaningful but ultimately temporary achievement that resets back toward zero once the moment of arrival has passed. If this framework gives you something concrete to apply when you reach your own milestone, subscribe. Because in 2 days we go deeper into the specific systems Dangote built to protect and grow capital once it began, compounding at meaningful scale. See you there.